In your discovery motion, if all you're doing is focusing on the types of questions you're asking, but you are not focusing on the order in which you ask them, you are missing out on a huge opportunity to create an indelible emotional impact in the mind of your customer. Now today I'm going to show you some crazy, scientifically proven tactics that will help you amp up the emotional impact of your questions. So welcome to another episode of Sales Lab Live. I'm David Priemer, and I'll tell you, what we're going to be talking about right now is a very advanced tactic, I have to say. So if you try this and you find, hey, look, it's taking you a little while to kind of get it, no worries at all. This is actually not even something I teach in my core training programs because it requires you to kind of master some of the tactics that come a little bit before it. But at the very least, I want you to give it a shot, and I want you to kind of just even be aware of the crazy science behind what we're going to be talking about today, because it's very, very powerful. Now, as we get into the content itself, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just refer you out to my book. If you want to read more about this, page 203 in the chapter on Mindful Discovery has a little section entitled The Surprising Science Behind Ordering Your Discovery Questions, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here, and then I'll get into the science, and then I'm going to get into more examples. And the study that I want to share with you right now has to do with some research that was done with some German university students. And what they did was they asked these students two very simple questions. The first question was about their level of happiness, and the second question was about how many dates they'd have in the last month. All right, now, bear with me here. So what do? They go to these university students and they say like, hey, look, how happy are you these days? And they just listen to whatever the answers the students give. And then they ask them, okay, well, how many dates did you have last month? So imagine this is like you're doing a little bit of discovery with your clients. And they wanted to see if there was some kind of like emotional correlation between these two questions, right? The idea would be, if someone, as a university student, you like going on dates, if you've been on a lot of dates in the last month, then you should be a happy person. And what they found that there was actually zero correlation between these two questions, right? So when you ask someone, how happy are you these days as a university student, the number of dates they've been on in the last month is not necessarily the first thing that comes up. And you realize this too. If I were to ask you, all right, how happy are you these days? How happy are you with your career or your relationships, right? Like, that's a big question, and lots of things come to mind. You might be like, oh, I'm happy about this, I'm not so happy about that. And so, this idea of kind of pairing questions and creating this emotional response is difficult when the first question I ask you is like a big question that doesn't produce anything that's, emotionally tangible. So what do? They go back to the experiment and they simply reverse the order of these questions. So they ask the students, hey, how many dates did you have in the last month? And then they ask them, okay, well, how happy are you these days? And what they noticed, my big head is blocking the big check mark behind. Hold on a sec. I'm gonna move this up so you can see. Boom, there's a check mark there. And what the take-home message here is that the correlation between the questions in the second instance was off the chart. And now I'm going to explain the crazy science behind why ordering the discovery questions like these is important. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, look, I order my discovery questions all the time. I ask my customers about the problem that they're having, and then how long they've been having it, and then, hey, can you give me an example of how long this problem's been happening, and like maybe what have you done to solve it, and how's that going? Those are what's called layered questions, right? Like, so we ask a question, when we ask something a little bit more detailed, can you give me an example? There is nothing wrong with layered questions, and you should absolutely be using layered questions. This is not a lesson on layered questions. This is about a psychological principle known as a substitution heuristic. And I will explain to you this concept with just a very simple example. If I were to show you this picture, and I were to ask you, so you can see there's just a black and white picture, there's some perspective here, and I said, hey, is the figure on the right larger than the figure on the left? So without taking out a ruler, you would look at this and be like, okay, it's tough, right? Like I'm actually not sure. I'm looking at the figures in black, and I'm saying to myself, it's actually really tough for me to tell. And so what do? I look around at the rest of the picture, and I see that these people are on some kind of like escalator or people mover, and it's kind of going off in the distance. And I see the lines of perspective, and I say to myself, okay, well, I'm looking at the other information around this picture, and the other information is telling me that these people are kind of moving off into the distance. So I would suspect that the figure on the right is larger than the one on the left. The reality is, if you were to take out your ruler and actually measure this stuff, you would see that the figures are exactly the same size. But what does the substitution heuristic principle tell us? What's a heuristic? Like a heuristic is just kind of like, it's like a guess, right? It's like a mechanism that we use to arrive at answers. And what the substitution heuristic tells us is that when we encounter, or more specifically, our minds encounter a question that it finds hard to answer, right? It finds hard for whatever reason. It tries to find an easier question that would rather answer instead, right? So when I ask you, for example, how happy are you these days? Your mind is all over the place. It's trying to, let me think about my relationships. Let me think about my business. Let me think about my health. And your mind is all over the place, right? Because answering that question of how happy you are is a hard one, right? And in sales, we ask these hard questions to our customers all the time. We say, are you happy with the vendor that you're currently using? Are you happy with the rates that you're paying, to your merchant fees? Are you happy with, how your team's doing? We ask these questions all the time, and they're very complex and multidisciplinary, and they often don't produce any immediate emotional response in the mind of our customer. However, here's the trick, right? When we ask our customer like a hard question, and all of a sudden, their minds start looking for questions that they would rather answer instead. If we've already asked them a question, a simple question, to which they have an immediate emotional response, that emotional response will tend to color the emotional response they have to the subsequent question, right? So again, if I were to go back to these examples that we just saw, right? When I ask you how many dates you've had in the last month, and you're a university student and you like going on dates, you're going to have an immediate emotional reaction. You know approximately how many dates you've been on the last month. Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 0? Is it 10? And you're going to have an emotional response to that. And then when I ask you how happy are you these days, what happens is the emotional response you have to that initial question then colors your response to the second question. So you're like, oh yeah, if you were actually happy about how many dates you've been on in the last month, you are more likely, statistically, scientifically, to answer that you are a happier person these days. So this is how we use the substitution heuristic to have this correlation between the questions that we ask happen. So the question then becomes, great, how can I use this in a selling context when I'm doing discovery with my customers, when I'm asking questions? And what I want to do is I want to give you examples of question pairings now, and I want you to see how these questions will pair with each other and will create this emotional response. And then I'm going to give you a bonus tip to help bring this all together. So think about these two sets of questions, right? If I'm asking a customer about their experience with a current vendor, like the vendor that they're using right now for whatever solution it is, I might say something like, well, how happy are you with your current vendor? And they might be happy or not happy, or they might like certain things, not like certain things. If I were to ask them specifically, how often did you need to call on your vendor, current vendor, for help this year, right? Then I hear what their answer is, and then I follow it up with something simple like, well, okay, great. How satisfied are you with the service you're getting? And the chances are, if the customer had to call that vendor many times for service or help over the last year, they might find that they're actually less satisfied with that vendor's service. I'm not saying the service per se, but the fact that I had to call so many times to get service means that there must be something wrong here, right? Now, think about this also in your personal life. If I were to ask you, how happy are you with your level of health these days, right? You might think, look, I'm trying to eat better. I'm trying to go to the gym. Okay, it's a hard question to answer. Now, look, I'm not saying these questions will be hard for everyone. But for most people, when you ask them these big, wide, broad-reaching questions, it's actually hard for them to answer. But instead, if I said, hey, look, if I assume that going to the gym is a proxy for how healthy you might be, I might ask you, well, how many times have you been to the gym in the last month, right? And then you're going to know the answer to that question. Is it 0? Is it 1? Do you go 4 times a week? And then if I follow it up with a question that says something like, for example, are you happy with your overall level of fitness? The emotional response you've had to the first question will color the emotional response you had to the second question. I'll give you another couple examples here, right? Let's say I'm talking about the quality of the products you're building. Like maybe I have a solution that helps you with, enhance the quality or security of the products that you're building. I might say, how many customer support calls did your team receive last quarter, right? Or how many security incidents or breaches or issues or bugs did you have last quarter? I'm just picking up a random time frame. And then I might ask you this question of like, hey, look, are you satisfied with the overall level of quality of the products that you're building, right? I know in my business, one of the things I focus on is obviously teaching these science and empathy-based sales tactics. And so I might go to a VP of sales or CRO or CEO and ask them, hey, are you happy with the performance of your sales team? Now, of course, that's another big question. It could vary based on so many different things, right? But if I asked you a more specific question around, let's say, for example, do you as a consumer, do you like talking to salespeople? And you're like, no, right? I've asked this question many times, so I know what the answer is. Do you like talking to salespeople? The answer is often no. Well, then, if I follow that up with a question like, how do you feel about your sales team's ability to connect with customers? I know my head's blocking a little bit, but I'm reading it here for you, right? How do you feel with your team about your team's ability to connect with customers, right? If I were to ask you that right off the bat, you might say oh, no, I think they're probably doing okay. I mean, there's some things they could do better or worse. But if I say do you like talking to salespeople? And you're like, no, and you have this immediate visceral emotional reaction. And then I say, well, how do you feel about your team's ability to connect with customers? Basically, what am I doing? I'm asking you to kind of go inside your own head here and say, I know you don't like talking to salespeople, and you probably just had this little mini epiphany and this little feeling of grossness, oh yeah, salespeople icky. And now I ask you about your sales team. Now all of a sudden, it's going to help focus your mind on the particular problem that I can help you solve. Now, here's the thing. I often refer to this as a little Jedi mind trick, right? Because what we're doing is we're just structuring the questions that we were going to ask anyways in a way that makes the problem that the customer could be experiencing. And again, as sellers, our job is to anticipate the problems that our customers are experiencing. And I talk about this a ton in the rest of the content on assumptive priming in my discovery sessions, and even back in my messaging content where I talk about using, and this is going to be my bonus tip for today as we kind of go into how we would actually use this tactic in the field. I want to give you this bonus tip around using the love-hate lead-in question to tee up this particular tactic. And that's why I say, by the way, this is more of an advanced tactic. Don't worry about mastering this right at the get-go. You have to get good at asking questions. The way you ask the questions, the tone, the approach, the words that you use, all of that has to be good, right? And after you've done that, now it's time to think about, okay, how do we structure the order of these questions to produce that all-important emotional response? Because again, if our customers don't have an emotional response to what it is that we're talking about, they're not going to lean in and say, oh, this is really interesting, tell me more. So our job as sellers is to produce that emotional response. So one of the ways that you can help create that emotional response is what I call the love-hate lead-in. So if I were to go back here for a second to the slide, the question that often people have is, okay, great, David, I get this idea of question order. How do I bring this up? How do I bring this up? And in fact, this is actually one of the things I cover at the end of my messaging course where I talk about, hey, look, and I covered this a little while ago. We talk about this idea that there's lots of different ways to use messaging in your pitch. And it's not just at the beginning when we're kind of pitching a customer or prospecting. You can use it all throughout the sales cycle. And the same thing happens as it relates to asking good discovery questions and mastering this idea of order, because we can use the love-hate tactic that I teach as a lead-in. So let's say, for example, I'm trying to sell you on a gym membership. Let's take that second example, right? How often have you been to the gym in the last month, and are you happy with your overall level of fitness? It's unlikely, if I was a personal trainer and you came to the gym, right, and you're now talking to me, it would be kind of weird if the first thing I said as we sat down was, so David, how often have you been to the gym in the last month? That could be a little presumptuous, right? If I was asking you about your current vendor that you're using, right, to solve the problem that maybe my solution can solve better, and I said, hey, how often did you have to call your current vendor for support this year? That question might be coming out of left field a little bit. Like we just started the conversation, right? Or maybe it's in the middle of the conversation, but still, it might make more sense, you would think, to start with a more general question and then focus it down. But here's a really easy lead in. So one of the things I talk about, again, is this love-hate statement. And the idea behind love-hate, just as kind of the quick refresher, is this idea that when we talk to our customers about what it is that we do, we use the words love and hate in a sentence to describe it, right? So like I might say, hey, look, people love to buy things. They hate talking to salespeople, right? People, especially millennials, they love feedback, but they hate performance reviews, right? Or men, they love to dress well, but a lot of men hate to shop, right? This is kind of what I call the love-hate, the polarizing statements that allow us to lead into the discussion. So how can we use this? Imagine a case, so now you're at the gym with me, and I'm talking to you, I want to talk to you about personal training. I might start off with a love-hate. I say, hey, so David, look, welcome to the gym. Hey, I'd love to know why you're here. A lot of people come into the gym, saying to me, hey, look, David, I would love to get in the best shape of my life, but I just hate the fact that I have no time. It's so hard. I'm not sure what exercises to do. And I totally get that. And, and my job here is to help you. If you don't mind me asking, how often do you go to the gym today? Like how often, let's say in the last month, have you been to the gym? Right now I'm going to sit here and wait for your answer. And then you're going to tell me whatever answer it is. And then I'm going to say, hey, look, no, I totally get it. Like, and maybe you tell me that you've only been to the gym once or twice. And I might say, hey, look, I totally get it. Like, are you happy with that number? Are you looking to come to the gym more often? After I've already primed you with the fact that most people who come to me because they love this idea of getting in shape, but they hate the fact that they don't have the motivation or time to figure out how to get to the gym to do it. That's where I help with my personal training services. Right? I'm not trying to sell you personal training services here. But the same thing can happen. Like, let's go back to the drawing board here. If, for example, I'm talking about the quality of the products you're building, right? How many support? So it would be weird if I just kind of dove in and said, well, how many support calls did your team receive last quarter? But if I said, hey, look, you know what? One of the things that, we work with engineers like you all the time, engineering leaders, whoever it is, my target buyers I'm selling to. And I say, like, look, they love building high quality products. They hate the fact that despite their best efforts, bugs, security issues tend to creep in to their products. And that's why, people typically come to us. And again, by the way, when I share these love hates, I'm actually not even talking about what I do. I'm not talking about my product. I didn't mention any features or functions or product names. All I'm doing here is I'm just talking about what people love, what people hate. So I might say, yeah, we work with engineering leaders like you all the time. And, the thing that we hear is like, look, they love producing these amazing, robust technology products. They hate the fact that, bugs creep in too often, especially now. Security issues come up, data breach issues come up. And so that's where we can absolutely help. If you don't mind me asking, David, one of the things that we often see as kind of the barometer for how well you're doing is support calls and tickets, around security and bugs and issues. How many of those would you say you've typically dealt with on a monthly basis? Like last month or last quarter, like how many of those have you seen, right? You answer, and if the answer is not good or you're not happy with it, and I say, hey, look, are you overall satisfied with the quality of the products you're building, or is that a good number in your world, right? Now I might have a point of view that, that may not actually be a good number, right? And you see what I'm doing here? I'm not leading in with like the question of like, how many dates have you been on? How many times have you been to the gym? I'm doing a little bit of a preamble lead in with a love-hate, which is the easiest messaging tactic I teach, and then leading in to this narrative with questions, starting with something that is very specific, that produces an emotional response that is more likely to focus the customer and color their emotional response to the subsequent question. And then I'm going to ask them that broader question that will hopefully trend in my direction and help me continue the conversation. So I told you right at the beginning that this was going to be an advanced tactic. So I don't want you to worry about mastering this tactic right away. What I do want you to do, though, is I want you to kind of just take this concept away and think a little bit about the science behind the concept. And then what I want you to do is I want you to think about, in your world, how would you create this emotional contrast with your lines of questioning, right? Like how might you take two questions in your world and order them in such a way such that the first question would produce that rapid emotional response. That second question would be the kind of the more general, like, hey, are you interested in basically kind of like moving forward with us response? And then think about how you would use kind of that preamble, like that love-hate, to lead into that question. If that's all you do, and you just start practicing that, rehearsing that, and trying slowly to integrate that into your sales motion, you are going to be in fantastic shape with this very, again, advanced tactic. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Sales Lab Live, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you again next week.